Welcome, everybody. My name is Mina Jane, and I am the director of the Ashland Public Library in Massachusetts. I'm very excited to be here with author Dennis Yi Tenen, who has written this amazing book called Literary Theory for Robots: How Computers Learn to Write. And he's going to be telling us uh, about his book, but also this perspective that he has coming from a literary background as well as a computer software background. So it's going to be fascinating. And we will be taking questions after Dennis finishes a short presentation. So I would like to thank the Friends of the Ashland Public Library for supporting all of our programs. Also, Dennis let us share this program with other libraries. And so a bunch of them jumped onto to partner with us. And I think when libraries work together, we make magic. So it's pretty awesome. And you can buy Dennis's book from Aesop's Fable. I'll put a link in the chat, but you can also order it from your local library and enjoy it and learn from it. So as I said, Dennis is a professor. Well, I didn't say he's a professor at Columbia University of Literature, associate professor of English. But he also has this amazing history and wrote this amazing book. So let's hear all about it, Dennis. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Mina, and welcome everybody. I spent quite a bit of time in Massachusetts, and I love libraries, so I'm really excited to be here. So while we are starting, I'm going to share my screen just so it's not just my face, and I'll entertain you with some slides. So let me see, share, probably not my inbox. All right, give me a second.
Oh,
all right, can you see that now? All right. So let me start by saying that I'll give you a little bit of the background of how I came to the book, to write this book, and also what will happen is in the telling of that story, hopefully we'll get a little bit, preview a little bit of the content of the book as well. So just like many of you, a few years ago when ChatGPT became a thing, and all of a sudden, how I forgot who wrote this. I think it's actually Hemingway wrote this first, where history moves slowly, and then all of a sudden. So all of a sudden, this thing was all over the news, but also already, it was in our inboxes, it was in our mail clients, it's in our Microsoft Word. If you write to any extent possible, at work, that spelling correction has been slowly improving. That auto-completion of your words on your phone has something that's been kind of slowly creeping up. And then all of a sudden, there's this almost existential dread about text generators getting this power to think or to write or to even kind of be creative in some capacity. So when that started happening, right away, I put my scholarly hat on, and I was wondering, where does this come from? What's the history? So this GPT thing is cool, and text generators are really neat, and they're changing the way we read, write, and search for information. But where did it come from? I'm going to set the timer as well. So, and what was interesting then is, as usual, I went to the library, I went to Google, and I started looking at whether there are histories available. And I saw that it's not a history that's very well articulated at all in other books. And I think partly, and I can tell you now, I didn't know that back then, but partly is that I was looking for that history in a slightly wrong place. Is that initially I thought I'm going to be looking at a history of technology, and specifically computer science and natural language processing. And there is portions of that, recent portions of that history are pretty well known. But as it turns out, that there's just a broader, longer scale of literary history that sheds light on the moment that we're in today. And that's what I'd like to share with you today. So let me also begin by reading a little bit from my book. And this is also should give you a sense that today's moment that always seems to us so exceptional actually has this long tail. And there are moments, there are other historical moments that I'd like to highlight for you that I think will help us understand our present moment as well. So let me give you some numbers for a sense of scale. This is from page 65 of the book. authors, prolific by 18th century standards, wrote on the order of a dozen or so major literary works. Okay, so somebody like Daniel Defoe, who wrote Robinson Crusoe, wrote, not counting his pamphlets, around 8 novels and 16 words of longer fiction. Now, Defoe is very interesting, actually, because he wrote with ghostwriters. Jonathan Swift, no stranger to text generators, found in his Gulliver's Travels, published 15 novels. Okay, so 12, 15 novels. That's really prolific by 18th century. Goethe, 6 novels, and about as many theater plays, so around like 12 major works. Jane Austen, 9 long novels, very prolific as well. Lawrence Stern, under 10 novels, depending on how you count some of them. Sir Walter Scott, 7 novels. Now, you can probably find somebody more prolific by that standard, but, more or less you see like from 7 to, 15 novels, like it's amazingly, amazingly productive for those days. Now, what's interesting is when I started looking at the data and I started compiling some of this data, I was truly shocked. So the word count began to climb dramatically in the 19th century. Somebody like Dickens and Dostoevsky, whose outputs were the envy of their contemporaries, and who both wrote serially for periodicals, penned fewer than 20 novels each. The Soviets published Count Tolstoy's collected works in 90 volumes. Dumas wrote more than 100 plays and novels, likely with the help of ghostwriters. But the first half of the 20th century, by the first half of the 20th century, such exceptional output became the norm. George Simenon, the Belgian writer of detective fiction, great writer, published 700 novels, 75 of them about the French police detective Jules Maigret. Now, we went from 12 to 700. Elizabeth Mead Smith, the author of A World of Girls, 1886, wrote more than 300 mysteries, romance novels, and works of young adult fiction. Paul Little, more than 700 novels. Kathleen Lindsay, that's Mary Faulkner, more than 900 novels under as many pseudonyms. Edward Stratemeyer, the American author-producer behind writer syndicates responsible for such popular series as The Rover Boys and Nancy Drew, in the thousands. The Spanish author of romance novels, Corinne Tellado, 4,000 novels. So that's just to give you a glimpse. We went in the 18th century and 19th century, we went from 7, 12, 15, 20 novels to, by the first half of the 20th century, writers routinely producing in the hundreds. So something happened already then that put authorship on an industrial basis. Now, if you consider the history of industrialism in general, the fact that some product became mass-produced in the early half of the 20th century shouldn't surprise us. Whether we're talking about the production of cars, or whether we're talking about the production of furniture or clothing, the industrial age brought with it a long kind of tradition of automation, and that automation happened across all domains. So we shouldn't therefore be surprised that automation would eventually touch authorship and knowledge workers of all sorts. And I think this is really the reality we're living in today. So once you look at the history of literature as a type of labor history, once you look at authorship and at authors as kind of workers, I think some of this blank timeline begins to be filled out. So let me now kind of show you a few of the breadcrumbs that started me out on this journey. So one of the first authors that I found in my search was George Pulte. And George Pulte, he's not a known, I doubt any of you have heard of him. None of my colleagues have heard of them, but his name began to pop up quite a bit in the sources that I was looking for. And so I was thinking, who was this George Pulte? He wrote in 1890s, he wrote this book called The 36 Dramatic Situations. And this book, it's a really funny book. It's a book, George Pulte was a struggling theater writer. And so he writes this book saying, you know, I have analyzed the most successful European theater productions in the last 100 years. And I have isolated the 36 dramatic situations that should be a part of any successful writer's kind of toolkit. And he really wrote this book. It wasn't a book of scholarship in a way that, you know, there's a whole scholarly tradition that tries to do something similar. But this was not at all like a highbrow scholarship book. This was a book written for other authors. And it said, you know, he explains that the reason why I'm writing this book is so that you know, maybe a young author can also experiment with these dramatic situations. And by combining them in various ways, you can quickly produce, you know, many stories and many plots that you didn't think of before. And it's really funny. At the end of the book, he says, you know, some people will call me the assassin of wonder. Some people will tell you that I have killed imagination, but it's nothing of the sort. Actually, this is a great tool to increase imagination. And if you don't believe me, send me 5 francs, he says in the conclusion of his book. Send me 5 francs and I will send you 10,000 plots. That's the way this book finishes in 1895 in French. Now, by 1916, it is translated into English, and it begins to appear quite regularly on the advertisements for in archive for the advertisements in the various writerly journals that also begin to appear around like 1890s. Okay, so here is the translation, this 36 dramatic situation by George Polty, and note, so it's somewhere, right? French edition came out in 95. Translation came out in 1916. Now note also translated by Lucille Ray and William Keane, and note this here, the editor company ends up being a really interesting kind of place. So when I found this book, I mean, I was kind of excited about this, but I still thought this was a marginal kind of thing. I thought it was still, you know, unknown person, you know, did not really represent a trend or anything like that, but I was wrong. So what did this book look like? So this is the 6th situation, disaster. It has elements of a vanquished power, victorious enemy, and a messenger. And it has various combinations, you know, defeat suffered, fatherland destroyed, the fall of humanity, and so on. And you can see on the right side here, he says, these scenarios will be, needless to say, of a realistic and effective character. I will contract to deliver 1,000 in 8 days. Oh, 1,000 in 8 days, he will deliver you 1,000 scenarios for the production of a single gross, but 24 hours are required. Prices quoted on single dozens. He's selling stories by the dozen. Write or call number 19, and so on. He gives his address in Paris. All right, now, as I said, the editor company ends up being important because the editor was a journal that was launched also, note the date, 1895. The editor, and note, first of all, what a beautiful cover. Quite difficult to find. Not many libraries collected these journals, but note the title. It's called The Editor, a journal of information for literary workers. And I have to tell you, I love all of these words: journal, information, literary workers. And just the fact that this journal existed was for me quite a revelation. And being a nerd, a bit of a nerd, I started reading a bunch of these journals. And certainly I've read countless copies of the editor itself. In the editor, you would see other, so here's James Naprieve again, former editor, the editor of the editor, founder and the editor of the editor. And what was very interesting is the kind of, not just the kind of articles that the editor would publish, but the kind of advertisements that they would place in their journal. So for example, here's a typical page here from 1923. You see the writer's book on the left side here, right? The most practical book for writers ever published. Technique of fiction writing, a modern rational work on the topic. How to write a short story. 88 ways to make money by writing. Of course, the familiar now 36 dramatic situations. This was advertised for several decades easily. It seemed to sell really well for Reeve and company. Writing for the trade press, the manuscript record, and the fiction factory, right? It just gives you a little bit of a glimpse. Now, you know, looking at this, you see that this is all in the genre of, I would call it like writer's aids. So it's really targeted at professional authors, and it is targeted to increase their productivity. It's how to write stories faster, how to write them of higher quality. And what really emerges, like the way I think about this, actually, like the fiction factory is a really good analogy here. If you think that in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, the manufacturing of most things in the world have moved from the workshop to the factory, we can also imagine that the production of literature in a sense of like labor history has also moved from the solo workshop into a kind of a fictional factory. And this book actually is amazing, The Fiction Factory. So if you can find it, also a really funny book. It's a writer who made thousands of dollars by setting up a story mill, tells a story of kind of how to write a lot and how to make money in writing. The amazing side quest from this particular work, The Fiction Factory, is that almost at the same time, also in the 1920s, there is a Soviet author named Platonov who also writes a book called The Fiction Factory. And they are not at all, it's just by coincidence, they're not at all aware of each other. You know, 1920s is a really tough time in Russia. But what in that book, he imagines kind of the Soviet communist version of a fiction factory, where you'll have all these researchers, journalists going out in the world and bringing back all sorts of information. And then there would be this writer engineer on a literal factory floor assembling those snippets of reality into stories useful for the communist project. So that was the Soviet version, and the Fiction Factory, you can think of it as the American capitalist version of the Fiction Factory. And they sort of align wonderfully around this notion of industrial production. So I'm not being fanciful here to say that writers are thinking already in the early 20th century of their craft in that sense of industrial production. It's not just me making that case. I think these materials really make that case strongly. So this timeline that began to be empty in the beginning, right? I didn't know where this story. All of a sudden, I started placing a few pins on that timeline, right? And then turns out that the late 19th century, 1880s, 1890s, you really have an explosion of these journals. And these are journals targeted towards professional writers. They are the writer, they are the editor, they are the author. I mean, not the names speak for themselves, but also Writers Review, Writers Monthly, Authors Digest, Markets and Methods for Writers, Author and Journalists. There's really quite a few of them. We already went through that. So this is 1923 is the American Fiction Factory, and Platonov's Fiction Factory is 1926. Remarkable coincidence. Now, on the pages of these journals, you also have books advertised besides Polti's 36 dramatic situations, and their books with titles like The Technique of the Drama. There are books like Plato, a new method of plot suggestion for writers of creative fiction, Technique of the Novel, but really quite a few. I mean, there are hundreds of them. Thomas English Skeleton Essays, basically sold essays to college students that you could fill in and then submit for a grade. Elizabeth Morris, The Drama, Its Law and Technique. Harriet Fensler, Types of Prose Narrative, fascinating person, graduated Columbia, sometimes in right around there in 1911, and got a job in Manila, Philippines, and went there to teach English and ended up writing also these like, what are the types of prose narratives with an eye towards teaching people to write in English. Wycliffe Hill plot genie as well. Now, how much time do we have? Not much time. I'll skip this story, but maybe I'll have time to tell it later. Alongside with the journals and the books that I found, at the same period, we also see really a flowering of these kind of like automated writing systems. One of these, Wycliffe Hill was created several of these. So here you see Robo, a game that writes 1 million story plots. And you also see the introduction of the plot genie system. So the plot genie system is a book that contains many different, it's basically lists of interesting characters, lists of interesting situations, dramatic situations again. And what you see here is the book came with this insert. You see there's a genie and there's an author looking it's like a magical ball, but it's an actual device. So on the right side here, it's two pieces of cardboard sandwiched together, and in between them there's a wheel that you can rotate. And the wheel right here, you see a little window, and by rotating the wheel, you would generate a random number, and then you would fill out the form. And as you fill out the form, you would then look up, there's like a slot for a character, a slot of the situation, a slot for the climax of the novel, a slot for the resolution. Then you look all those things up, and what you get is this skeleton plot that you can then fill out with realistic detail. And this is called the plot robot that came with the plot genie. This is 1916, a patent by somebody named Blanchard. And it's an automatic movie writer. And you can see, I don't know if you can see very well, but it's basically a box that's about like a tabletop box. And what you can do is you rotate this little levers, and the lever is actually a scroll with different options visible through the window. And you can see that in this case, the mechanism produces a plot about an aged aviator that bribes and cannibal, and then carousal ensues and they escape. That's the plot of this movie. That's 1925 patented device. Now, like I said, I found many of these fascinating systems. You can think of them, so if you imagine a fiction factory, my question would be, what kind of machines, what kind of mechanisms do you find in Fiction Factory? And besides the plot robot and Plato and the movie maker, you find all sorts of devices that are being sold to writers. This one is called the Webwork, also 1928, but a fascinating system that was quite popular. You see a whole range of filing devices, so filing technique, filing cabinets, filing all sorts of stationery products targeted towards writers which were meant to take notes, to take snippets of overheard conversation, to take snippets from newspapers and kind of juicy detective crimes that you would collect and organize and then use as the material to flesh out those skeleton stories that you would create using the other machines. So there's like I have a whole chapter on physical devices. I think that's pretty fascinating. And so again, all of this to say that what initially looked for us as an empty plot line, once you start rewinding it, and once you start looking at authorship as a kind of a labor practice, you find other early, and these are pre-digital text generators, which can account for some of that incredible, tenfold, sometimes 100-fold increase in productivity that we witness already at the turn of the 20th century. Now, that's pretty much where I want to. It's just, as you see, it's a little snippet. The timeline is longer, and I do have many other stories that go back all the way to 14th and 15th centuries. So there are other blank spots that we can fill in. And of course, after World War II, once the major universities like MIT and places in Wisconsin and Stanford, once they get their first computers, you really see a flourishing of actual digital text generators. And I also have a bunch of stories about those in the book. And, there were different competing camps and different ideas of how to do this. And all of that together leads to this present moment of GPT-4. I think I'll stop there. I hope that's, a little bit of a glimpse, a little short, we picked a part of this timeline, and I hope I showed you a little bit of the kind of fascinating material that was found in the archive. And maybe I'll stop here and take some of your questions. I'll stop sharing.
Hello. Oh, I think I'm in, I want to be in gallery view. Okay, great. So everybody can see both of us. Dennis, that was really interesting. Kind of unexpected for me to think about the history of where this has come from. So, so I don't want to call it, so like people have been helping authors write books for many, 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 many thousands of years or hundreds of years.
Right.
So one thing that was, I was going to, for anybody who's here, please put your questions in the Q&A. There's a button at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask Dennis, but I have plenty, so I'm happy to just go on with my own as well. So let me talk, so that what happened at that maybe 1900s where people had been writing 20, 30 books, and all of a sudden they were writing hundreds to thousands of books. What was happening in that moment?
Well, I think, so what you see is a number of techniques emerge, and think of them as like systems. So they're really like how to write more. And it was couched in that language, that they weren't like secretive about it. How do you write more? How do you submit more? And so various techniques emerged which help authors do something like that. Now, at the same time, you see, also, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little bit of an echo.
Oh, again? Let me just make sure I'm in the right.
Yeah, that's okay. So, as you can, if you saw the titles of those journals, like clearly sometime in the late 19th century, early 20th century, you have this explosion of writing as a profession. So it seems like many new writers enter the market, and therefore you have these journals targeting professional authors, but they're usually, let's call them like either genre fiction or like middlebrow authors. These are mostly authors who are writing for pulp fiction. They're writing jingles for radio. Hollywood is beginning, the silver screen is beginning to purchase stories, and of course Broadway is another big. But basically, it coincides. This movement in early 20th century coincides with the time when writing becomes a profession and not just like a hobby. You can make a living, and I think that also accelerates the productivity as well.
So let's flash forward to now, or when this all really became, AI became so in our consciousness about writing. One of the things we talked about before people started coming in was that for a long time it was in manufacturing, it was in retail, things like that, and we sort of were like, it's not that big of a deal. But now it seems like every facet of our lives. And what was the difference there? What woke us up?
Well, I want to push back against this idea that it happened only now, because you can see that, part of my point is that we've been writing with AI and with external aids. It's just AI is just another term for like technology. But if there's a notion of like a singular genius author that's very romantic, and it's not, it doesn't withstand scrutiny. This notion of a writer sitting at their desk and they're like a lone genius, and all the smart ideas come out of their unique kind of talent. But that's truly a romantic notion. If you actually look at the history of authorship, you see that writing with style guides, writing with external tools, writing according to a template. Now, so is the plot robot from 1895, is that a AI or not? It is kind of, it's artifice, it's definitely artificial, and it's a smart device. And people thought of this as a device that in some ways accelerates, mental work.
Mhm.
So in that sense, I think that makes our present moment is just kind of the continuation of that history. Is that,
Mhm.
as you said, many jobs, automation has disrupted and changed many jobs throughout history, right? And kind of under the same timeline, it really intensified also in the industrial age.
Mhm.
You know, if you were an auto worker or a shoe cobbler, I don't know that, you know, you've been disrupted 100 years ago already, right? But yeah, I think the mistake was to think that people who are knowledge workers are somehow exempt from automation. I think that's a rude awakening.
Mhm.
But it shouldn't, when we look at the history, it shouldn't surprise us actually.
Mhm.
It's, you know, once we recognize, and I'll say our own, you know, I'm a knowledge worker, I'm a professor, I write, you know, most of my kind of income comes from writing and from teaching. But once we recognize ourselves as workers, as part of the labor market, and once we see authorship as part of labor history, then it falls into the history of automation. And
Mhm.
you know, the story of disruption is kind of goes has touched almost every aspect of every human discipline was touched by automation.
Mhm. So one of the juxtapositions that I've been hearing about is the difference between biological intelligence versus artificial intelligence. Because what it sounds like you're talking about before, like the machine learning was really people like listening in on people and coming up with ideas and writing these style guides and stuff. And now with the machine learning, it's just accelerated even that much more. Is that a fair comparison?
No, there is, but you know, this is like I want people to have like a different view of so you know when you say bio and that's why I don't really like the term artificial intelligence and biological intelligence because if you think about it, like most of the things I know, me personally, I know very little things. Like
Mhm.
I'm not that, you know, I'm not that smart. If you ask me like, what is the distance to the moon? I'll be like, I have no clue. How does, you know, how do electrons work? I mean, most of the things that we as humans know, as a society, as what we know is incredible. What I know personally is tiny. But I know where to look it up. You know, I go to the library, I go
Mhm.
to Google, I go to the various, and point is that my natural intellect is comparatively tiny. It's constantly augmented and helped by really social intelligence. I enter like when I don't know something, I know I kind of ask other people, basically ask other people, right? Like I ask through book, but that collective activity is mediated through books. It's which are a type of technology. It's mediated through a computer. It's mediated through a phone. So in that sense, I would say most intelligence work that we do it's already artificial. The biological part is small.
Mhm.
And it's been like that long before the computer, right?
Mhm.
Like what should amaze us here is the fact that in like what we know and our collective human intelligence is incredible. Like
Mhm.
that's the magical part, is the fact that together we can each of us knowing so little can like, you know, send people to the moon or discover the nature of, you know, the electron. Like that's pretty amazing. But like I didn't do that. We did this. And so once you partly how I end the book is to say that artificial intelligence is collective intelligence. So
Mhm.
that's, you know, if there's a punchline to kind of in answer to your question is to say like let's not just look at AI, but let's AI is a type of a collective intelligence. Through AI, I am able to collaborate better with other people.
Mhm. I guess, the most uh, pushback that I hear about AI or machine learning is that the machines are taking our work without giving us credit. Like copyright
Yeah.
issues around art and writing and things like that. So, how does that fit into this worldview of intelligence, a collective intelligence?
Right, right. Well, again, so note, by the way, note my strategy here that every time you ask me about the machine part, I'm answering kind of saying, let's look at the actual, like even before machines, we have this problem. So I would say that, you know, writing in general, like if you sort of if you're along with me for this ride, to say that writing is fundamentally a shared collective enterprise. So when I write, the language doesn't belong to me. I'm constantly using snippets of this is part of writing, is reusing, remixing constantly.
Mhm.
Now, the fact that there is a legal framework around it that protects, so certain creative remixing is protected and certain other is not, so that is an interesting problem, and we always struggle with it. But I think basically if you begin at a point where when you don't feel like when you write that it's actually just you, that if you're like truly acknowledge the influence of that collective on your own writing, then the fact that the machine learns also by dipping into the same pool of talent, that's not surprising because that's how humans write,
Mhm.
right? Like humans are constantly sort of remixing each other's work, and right, like we are constantly rewriting the plots, like I mean that's one of the key techniques for creating something new is you take the basic structure of the Iliad and then you set it in Washington Heights and then it becomes like an amazing work, right? Like
Right.
that's so we're constantly doing that. And so again, it's just once you reconfigure your baseline, like what is natural, what do we do without computers? Once you understand it as a collective endeavor, then the intrusion of the computer seems not as revolutionary because it's just continuing along the same lines.
Mhm. Do you think though it's a matter of scale because a computer can do it very quickly and very unemotionally? Um,
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So it is a matter of scale. So the fact that machines can, the fact that we can be drowned in, so basically imagine there's a conversation happening and there's like three people talking at a party, and then all of a sudden like 3,000 robots stop by and start buzzing about and drowning out the conversation. I do think that's a problem. So just scale itself is, it's something that um, that we struggle with. And also, but I would say like look at how we struggle with scale in other aspects of our life,
mhm.
whether it be food, whether it be roads, whether it be, like basically technology. We're victims of our own success. We create machines that then we end up, our houses are full of clutter, our brains are full of TikTok videos, or so so I think the scale is a problem, we should think about like what I mean, it's the whole thing, like what do we want this technology to do for us? So there is, I think, I don't mean to dismiss the kind of concerns you're raising. I think there are some new challenges that we have ahead. But as you see, I'm also kind of hopeful a little bit.
I appreciate that because I've been feeling a little less hopeful, but I don't actually feel like you're being dismissive. I feel like you're educating me on like the bigger picture here because we do get really like telescoped into the fear that is happening. Um, but I'm curious about like um, copyright, especially as a librarian. So, in the past, when you were doing sort of just listening into stories and things like that, writing them down, having a template or whatever, even then it wasn't allowed for you to take an entire paragraph or an entire chapter from another writer and plop it into the middle of your story. And at least like on some of those larger scale sites like Amazon, KU, whatever, that's happening a lot where people are just taking stuff from other writers and putting it right into their own stories. So, how do you differentiate between something like that, which is obvious copyright infringement, versus like taking snippets of things and making your own story?
I mean, look, again, there is, I think there is a narrow legal issue here that I think is, specific to the United States, right?
Mm.
And our legal regime. But I think the broader, I mean, it's again, if you imagine your brain, like, here's what I'm trying to do. Imagine your brain. If you just imagine that everything that's produced by your brain is yours and it's like your property,
Mm.
that's just like and then you get anxious about like, oh my God, I have this creative idea. But I suggest we like when I imagine my brain, I think of the library, for example, as part of my brain,
Mhm.
and the computer is part. And so that brain, it's not just all mine, it's actually primarily has all of these extensions that are, and I think in the fact that there are like other other robots that they're organizing information for us and presenting it and churning through it, I think that, that bothers me a little bit less. Now, I do think, let me tell you what does worry me in your question, because you know how I started by saying it's kind of there is an American regime. The fact that, the history of public libraries in the United States is really fascinating to me. And I think it's also part of that idea that information should be accessible broadly to all people. Now, the fact that AI technology and some of these tools that we see coming out recently, they are made by mostly American and North European corporations. I begin this book with an anecdote from Kyrgyzstan, from Central Asia, where I was giving a talk. And when people from those countries, when people globally ask the same question you're asking, they're not thinking of copyright regime in the United States. They're more thinking about how we have these amazing tools and we are paywalling these amazing tools, to reach into a subscription to PubMed, right? If as a doctor, to see the latest in the latest research on how cancer is cured. This is like more or less a trivial thing in the United States. You can go to the library or you can go to your local university. Outside of the United States, that article costs hundreds of dollars. And your library, the subscription to the services costs millions of dollars. And a lot of the world, physicians, scientists, researchers all over the world are not able to forget like automation just to look something up. So there is like a huge imbalance in their ability to use that world brain, right? Like their brain, they're physically prevented from entry into that sort of, like I said, pool. And of course, they're also not allowed to develop or imagine automated tools that would help them locally accelerate like whatever they're trying to do. Like, yeah, right. So our companies are able to, Google Books was able to scan a bunch of, they made deals with libraries, they scanned, and now they're building tools around it. But there are incredible inequities in the United States too, but once you start looking outside, you see, it becomes obvious. The inequities become obvious. So that's, and those are, that worries me more than like, will the American copyright regime survive? Because I think, no, copyright, laws will, copyrights will, the notion of copyright changes with our capacities and abilities and so on. And, there'll be a complicated renegotiation of what it means to create. So, but the global perspective is quite important as well here.
I hadn't thought about that. And just to clarify one thing, as far as I know, there was one major library that partnered with Google Books, and then they got shut down because of copyright issues. But that was like 5 or 7 years ago, and you might have more knowledge about that. But I just wanted to say it wasn't a collective of libraries. It was, I think, the Harvard Digital Library or something like that.
It was several. They scanned, Google scanned books from Michigan, for example, which has a huge collection from Harvard. They made a deal with several libraries, but yeah, it's probably not it was the large research holdings that they went after.
Yeah, and no, I just wanted to point that out because I think that, as a low-level librarian in a tiny town in Ashland, in Massachusetts, I'm kind of like, oh, I didn't think that we were part of that, but okay. But it's just interesting that there's this perspective of the US and then there's the world perspective of having access to materials that people here feel that they do own. And I hear what you're saying about we have to think about it differently.
Yeah, and the other thing it makes me think that I think quite important, and maybe your listeners and your patrons will relate to that, is that, like the copyright question is one about like creative writing and maybe a few other disciplines. But if most of us in our daily life, we write a lot, but we write like emails, or let's say if you're a physician, you're writing like patient reports. And the point is that the majority of the text produced, in the world is actually incredibly templated. It's incredibly automated. And the issue of And there, like, to what extent, like a doctor's, a physician's notes are copyrighted? Like, that's not even, you know what I mean? And in a sense, that's, to me, that's a really interesting question, like how, and machines and templates, like if you think about like going to the doctor listens to you, tell him your story, and then they're clicking buttons and their drop down menus, and they have templates, and what they're doing is they're translating your story as a patient into this like medical system, and it becomes a record, and then it becomes a billable code sent to, like, that also is a whole literary system, a whole textual system where machines are constantly sort of maintaining, you know, it's another kind of archive, another kind of library. So
Mhm.
I think, you know, I'm thinking not just of like fictional writing, but writing of all sorts, which is actually primarily done by template, and
Mhm.
it's like not creative. It's the opposite of creative. You don't want your physician to like improvise creatively on your symptoms, you know.
Yeah. Somebody does point out that, or it says that the doctor's notes are protected under HIPAA.
Of course, yeah, they're protected under HIPAA, but not copyright. Like, I'm just saying, creativity is not the issue there. There are other legal matters, right? But it's not like the you know, I think copyright as it exists today, it protects, you know, more narrowly creative writing, and I think a creative writing in a very particular moment of its establishment.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So I'm going to go back to the creative thing because the one thing I do hear about is obviously writers, but also artists um, who are protecting their artwork it, by not by opposing machine learning and AI. Um, so are you saying that there's nothing that really is original now, thinking or artwork, and that it is that why it should be available?
No, look, I'm not making like a political or God forbid legal point here, but no, I'm not saying that. But I'm just saying that the default, you know, authorship is complicated, and copyright doubly so, because there's a cultural concept of authorship and creativity, and around it is a legal framework. So the legal framework changes with the times, right? But I'm more concerned with our notions of authorship. But
Mhm.
I think like I'm more comfortable speaking just like not
Yeah.
legally, but in terms of what authorship is. And when we look at what authorship is, like, I'm not super invested in like policing some boundaries of originality, because I think they were never there to begin with. I mean, if you think about, like, maybe, you know, the art world is kind of ahead of us. Like, basically, you know, who was it, Duchamp, you put like the urinal into a museum, like, is the urinal original? Did, you know, like, you know, like, ceramics are amazing, like modern, the people who design furniture, design modern commodes or whatever it is, like, that's also art, but right, in a different
Mhm.
context, it gains this like different kind of prestige, it becomes a museum piece. So writing kind of works the same way. Writing is constantly, you know, it is snippets, it is wholesale borrowing from other people, and it's placed in different contexts. And also, it, you know, I don't think we are interested in other people. So I'm not worried about like us losing interest in like personal stories and kind of, right, like connecting with other individual people. Like, I don't think robots will take that capacity away from us.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, what was I going to say? Oh, I always find authors to be really interesting because they always say they're one, they're readers, and two, they're people watchers,
Yeah.
observers of life around them. So I do hear what you're saying about picking up ideas from every place else, but the idea of an author, so like we're going back to that 1900 around then of people
Mm.
starting to write 700 to 4,000 books. Is that because there were more ghostwriters or more people, like people having a staff that does their research? I mean, what changed at that point for in that perspective?
Well, I think the emergence of writer, so what I kind of hinted at the emergence of writer collectives. So, you know, there are novels like the Rover Boys, you know, they're like young adult fiction or pulp fiction where there's actually, you can think of like, there are some authors who become like more like producers.
Mhm.
right? Instead of, so it's not that I individually write everything. I have a team of writers that write for me, and I orchestrate their efforts in some ways, and I make sure that the style is uniform, right? So that becomes a thing, but also the various techniques that are there to actually accelerate the process of writing. So I think all of that together, produces a very different kind of authorial practice than what we kind of imagine. If you actually look at how authors work, like imagine, it's a good, like the closest thing today is think about your favorite TV show, like serial TV show, Law and Order. You know, how many seasons? 27 seasons or whatever of Law and Order. You have the executive producer. You probably have hundreds of writers uh, synchronizing their episodes, tying in some plot lines. What originality is within Law and Order? That's a really kind of funny question, right? Because they're clearly pulling from newspapers all the time. So whenever, like, sometimes you recognize the stories, you're like, oh yeah, I remember that this crime happened in Central Park, and now they made, so that's not really original.
Mhm.
The way they speak and the way they borrow from the various communities in New York, right? Okay, that's not the, but point is, but yet you recognize the signature of Law and Order, right? And maybe sometimes you look at, produced by Dick Wolf or whatever it is. Like we want to assign like a singular name, but we kind of realize that it's a product of hundreds of people, and it's like it's constantly pooling inside of its universe all of this material. And I
Mhm.
think that's authorship,
Mhm.
right? It's this process of art. It's not create singular creation that's uniform. It's a process of immense orchestration of resources.
Mhm.
So the writer of today and the writer of the future is the person who orchestrates, and some of these resources are automated. Some of them are, it's going to the library, it's using ChatGPT, it's interviewing people, it's consulting your notes, it's maybe writing with other people. Like most writing is like that. We're orchestrating something.
Mhm. Oh.
And I think once you have this more expensive model, protecting the idea that no, I wrote this personally becomes like, it's just less interesting. I also think it's less true in some way. It doesn't ring true. It's
Mhm.
it's a it's a romantic notion of how text is produced.
Mhm. Sort of that collective position as opposed to individual, which you had mentioned before. Um, Somebody asks about movable type. Typewriters were invented in 1868. The Gutenberg press was,
Mhm.
created in like the 1500s or 1600s. Did those kind of technologies have an effect on the ability for people to be more prolific in writing?
I think so as well. I think Matthew Kirschenbaum has a great book on typewriters. I mean, I don't talk about typewriters as much in this book, but certainly, just I guess the speed of writing, though, cursive is comparable in speed. It's not that it's introduced. Um, so, I mean, to what extent typewriters changed writing? It's a very interesting question, but I think uh, what I would do is place the typewriter. I wouldn't just say like, it's never easy. Like typewriter came and it had this change. So it doesn't really work like that. There are multiple sort of technological advances that happen at the same time. What you see with the advance of typewriters is just the incredible flourishing of like office supplies, of various like, and people like, imagine people were excited about filing cabinets. There's a journal of filing technique from that period. I love it. It's like the nerdiest thing ever. But point is, and yes, like a lot of it is about typewriters, but a lot of it is like there is a new indexing system that you can like install in your office, right? Like there are all these kind of inventions, but then the way it ends up influencing literature, for example, is that so in the office, in your bank or in your insurance company, you have a better filing technique for your or whatever. In a doctor's office for your patients. At home, these journals suggest that you begin to systematically collect pieces of information. But once you have hundreds, thousands of snippets that you've collected and you want to incorporate them into your writing practice, well, okay, you can't just have a big pile. Like it was said that De Quincey had kept his notes in a bathtub. the author. Like you can't just have a bathtub. You need to organize. So you're writing about war. You need a soldier. You have a character that's a soldier. So you look up under ass. And there's like incredible nerdiness there. They're like cross. So it's a soldier, but he's wounded. So you cross-reference under ass and under medicine, under am, and you have this like multiple systems. And it's all about like how can you quickly bring a character to life with realistic detail. But it wasn't just something that you sit down and you're like, let me create a realistic soldier. The realistic soldier was created by that activity of collecting and organizing information, and then being able to like quickly pull it out. And then like you already have that like local color, like the way they speak. You may be like sitting in a bar somewhere and just writing overheard stuff down. So that's, and within that office supply universe, there's also the typewriter, right? Like it's among of these, it's like things around you are being automated, right? Like the writing desk is no longer just the desk. It has other furniture here. Typewriter over here, filing cabinet here, so on. That's how I view it.
I think I finally understood what you're trying to get across, is that we all collect information all the time. However we organize it is up to us. But an author takes all of this information that you might have the exact same information. I might have the exact same information, but I'm going to tell a different story because I put those bits of information together differently than you would. So the originality comes in the way that we tell the story, not in where we get the information from.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah. Oh,
Okay.
I agree with that. Yeah. And note like that the point is the way you collect information and then the way you author it changes. So this is the reason why so many of the books in the 1890s and 1910s, they have this word technique in them. Because they're like, here's a new technique, technology. Here's a new technology for writing. And that technology is like faster. I mean, they literally, so this is like shameful little secrets of authorship is that the professional literature, they're not shy to say, write more manuscripts. You're going to sell more. And maybe, like it's that's too, like your James Joyce or something. Like point is maybe the high modernist authors of that period would not admit to doing that. But the person who is like a middle brow author in New York or somewhere in the Midwest just trying to survive, they're trying to place more manuscripts. They're trying to, so they will, and they're using these techniques to actually increase their productivity in a very directed way.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. I mean, I am a huge, romance, sci-fi, horror reader, and I see that's why they have the tropes. There's certain things that work, and you just put them together differently and you have a new story. So, okay. Wow. After an hour, I think I really get it. Like what you've been talking about. Thank you so much. This has been really fascinating. A very, very different way of looking at things, but one that I think we all need to understand.
Well, I'm glad we had the chance to talk, and please, I extend this to you and to your audience. Please don't hesitate to get in touch.
Excellent. I will put that out in my recap email, but I do appreciate your time and your expertise on this topic, and I appreciate everybody who stuck with us for this conversation, and I hope you all have a wonderful night figuring all these things out in your own head. So, good night, everybody.
Good night.